Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at writing effective use cases. And we've got some excerpts here from the book, Writing Effective Use Cases. And there is so much to unpack here. I'm so glad to have you here with me to help sort through it all. To kick things off, let's zoom out for a second and think about the big picture. Why do we even bother writing use cases? What's the core purpose that sometimes gets lost when we're wrestling with the details?
That's such a great starting point. It's so easy to get bogged down in the mechanics and lose sight of the why. The book really hammers home this point. A use case is all about value. It's about capturing how a system, and this could be anything from a piece of software to a business process or even something like a vending machine, how it delivers value to its users or stakeholders. We're not just listing features or steps. We're telling a story about how someone achieves a specific goal by interacting with that system.
So it's about value and goals, not just the technical nuts and bolts. That makes a lot of sense. So how do we translate that value and those goals into a use case that's actually effective? How do we capture that essence on paper?
Well, one of the fundamental concepts the book introduces is the actors and goals model. It's a framework for thinking about use cases in terms of who's interacting with the system, what are they trying to achieve, and how does the system help them get there. The book argues that by clearly identifying those actors and their goals up front, you're setting a really strong foundation for everything that follows.
So we're talking about figuring out the who and the why before we dive into the how. Okay, I can see how that would help keep the focus on value, but let's unpack that who a bit more. Who exactly are these actors? Is it just the people using the system?
Not always. The book actually distinguishes between primary actors and secondary actors.
No.
So the primary actor is the one whose goal is driving the use case. They're the ones initiating the interaction, and they have a specific outcome in mind. Secondary actors, on the other hand, they're sort of the supporting cast. They play a role in helping that primary actor reach their goal.
Okay, so it's like a play. You have the main character driving the plot, and then you have the supporting characters that help or hinder them along the way. Speaking of supporting roles, the book has this great anecdote about an ATM bid where the team almost made a big mistake because they didn't properly identify the printer as a secondary actor. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, yeah. That anecdote perfectly illustrates how crucial it is to really nail down the roles of the different actors. So in that particular case, the team was so focused on the technical details of integrating the ATM with the printer that they almost bid on building a whole printing system from scratch.
Right.
When all they needed to do was just make sure the ATM could talk to an existing printer. They mixed up a secondary actor for a primary one, and it almost cost them big time.
That's such a good illustration of how getting those roles mixed up can lead to scope creep and a whole lot of unnecessary complexity. It seems like avoiding that kind of confusion is crucial, especially in complex systems where you have multiple actors and all these interconnected goals. And speaking of goals, the book uses this really interesting term, recursive goals. What does that mean exactly? It sounds a bit intimidating.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. It's basically acknowledging that goals often have layers. So you might have a big overarching goal, right? But to reach that goal, you need to achieve a bunch of smaller sub-goals. And those sub-goals might have their own sub-goals and so on. It's like if you picture a tree with branches that keep splitting off into smaller and smaller twigs, that's kind of what recursive goals are like.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this recursive thing could get a little hairy when you're trying to write a use case. We need to make sure we're capturing all those layers of goals without getting lost in the weeds. And this brings us to another important concept from the book, scope and level. Can you unpack those for us?
Sure. The book really emphasizes the importance of being crystal clear about what's in scope for a particular use case and what's out of scope. It's about defining those boundaries so everyone is on the same page about what we are and are not addressing.
So it's like drawing a circle around the interactions we're focusing on and leaving everything else outside that circle.
Exactly. We need to set limits so that we can tell a focused and coherent story without getting bogged down in unnecessary details. And when it comes to level, the book talks about strategic goals, user goals, and subfunction goals. These different levels help us understand the hierarchy of goals and make sure we're addressing the right level of detail for our audience.
Okay, so we've covered some key ideas here. The purpose of use cases, actors, and their goals, this whole recursive nature of goals, and the need for clear scope and level. But now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of actually writing the thing. The book outlines a 12-step process. Is this something that's useful for everyone, even people who've been writing use cases for years?
You know, it's definitely a very comprehensive approach, and I think it can benefit writers at all levels. Even if you're experienced, it can serve as a really useful checklist. And for folks who are newer to use case writing, it provides a clear structure to follow. One thing I find interesting is that the book doesn't just jump into the steps. It starts by stressing the importance of beginning with a system in use story.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's all about grounding the use case in a real-world scenario, like actually picturing how the system will be used by real people to achieve their goals. Sometimes when I start writing a use case, it feels too abstract and disconnected from reality. But this system in use story seems like a great way to avoid that trap.
It really is. It's a powerful technique for making the use case come alive and making it more relatable for both the writer and the reader. It helps you visualize the context, the actors' motivations, the potential challenges they might face. It's all about setting the stage for a really compelling and informative story.
That makes so much sense. It's like we're creating a little mini narrative that's going to guide the whole rest of the process. So, out of those 12 steps, is there one that you find particularly insightful, or maybe one that people often tend to overlook?
One that really stands out for me, and I think is often missed, is this idea of doubling goals and interests against success and failure conditions. It really forces you to think not just about what happens when things go right, but also what happens when things go wrong. It's about looking at both sides of the coin.
Okay, I'm curious about this doubling thing. What does that actually mean in this context? And how does it help us write better use cases?
Doubling, as the book describes it, is about ensuring your use case is thorough and robust. It's about examining each goal and stakeholder interest from two perspectives. What happens when that goal is achieved successfully? And then what does it look like when that goal fails? Doing this can help us uncover potential risks and alternative paths that we might miss if we're only focusing on the happy path.
So we're basically creating a mirror image of that success path, but mapping out all the potential points of failure.
Exactly. And by doing that, by considering both sides, you get a much deeper understanding of how the system behaves, what the stakeholders really need, and the potential consequences of actions.
I can see how valuable that would be, especially with complex systems where there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that could potentially go wrong. It's like you're building in resilience from the very beginning.
That's right. And it's not just about identifying those failures, but it's about understanding how they might affect the stakeholders and what steps we can take to minimize the impact. It's about designing for both success and failure, which ultimately results in a more robust system.
That's a great insight. It's like we're not just writing a use case, we're also creating a plan for what to do when things go wrong, which, let's face it, they inevitably will.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not reactive. And this actually ties in nicely with another point the book makes, the power of writing those failure conditions first.
Huh, that's interesting. Why would writing about failures before successes lead to a better use case?
It might seem counterintuitive, but when you force yourself to think about what could go wrong, it actually helps you write a more well-defined success scenario.
Mm,
Because once you've mapped out those potential pitfalls, you can design your main flow to avoid those pitfalls or at least minimize their impact.
I see. It's like you're preparing for a debate. If you've already anticipated your opponent's arguments, you can build a much stronger case of your own.
Exactly. It's about challenging your own assumptions and exploring those what-if scenarios to make the system more resilient. But let's be real, sometimes we can get so caught up in the details that we spend way too much time perfecting a use case. At what point do we hit diminishing returns? When does all that extra effort stop adding value? You're hitting on a really common struggle, and the book addresses this tension between wanting to be thorough and recognizing that we have limited time and resources. They talk about this concept of diminishing returns, the idea that after a certain point, you're not really gaining much by adding every little detail. You've got to know when to stop polishing and move on.
So it's finding that sweet spot between having enough detail and not getting bogged down, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes good enough really is good enough.
absolutely. It's about focusing your energy where it matters most, capturing the essential information, making sure it's clear and easy to understand, and getting the message across.
I love efficiency. So let's talk about writing those action steps. The book talks about clear and concise steps, but what does that actually look like? How do we make those steps really sing?
One of the key things is using active, goal-oriented verbs. It might seem like a small tweak, but it makes a huge difference. Instead of saying the system checks the user's credentials, you could say the system verifies the user's credentials. It's much more direct and engaging, and it clearly conveys the action.
Okay, that's a great tip. Use strong verbs, got it. But what about formatting those steps? Should we use numbered lists or write them out in paragraphs? There seems to be some debate about that.
Yeah, there are definitely different preferences out there. The book actually acknowledges both styles as valid. The key they emphasize is consistency. Whether you go with numbers or paragraphs, stick with it throughout the entire use case.
Okay, so pick a lane and stay in it.
Exactly. Consistency just makes it so much easier to read and understand. And speaking of clarity, here's a fun little analogy the book uses. Think of each step in a use case as a pass in a soccer game, and ask yourself, who's got the ball?
I love that. Each step should clearly show who's taking action and what they're doing.
That's it. If you can easily picture who's doing what, then you're on the right track. It's all about making those actions clear and easy to follow.
Now, speaking of challenges,
Yeah.
let's face it, no system is perfect. No matter how carefully we plan, things are bound to go wrong somewhere along the line. So how do we handle those inevitable failures and hiccups in a way that's both thorough but not completely overwhelming?
It's definitely a balancing act. The book actually has some really reassuring advice on this. They emphasize brainstorming all the potential failures you can think of. Don't be shy about it. Think timeouts, bad data, user errors, even malicious intent. The more you can anticipate those trouble spots up front, the better equipped you'll be to handle them gracefully.
Okay, so embrace the chaos. It's like a preemptive strike against Murphy's Law, right?
Yeah.
Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So let's just plan for it now. So we're not just identifying those potential detours, but we're figuring out how to navigate them smoothly. The book talks about using an extension approach. Can you explain what that means?
It's all about keeping your main success scenario streamlined and focused. Instead of cluttering it up with a bunch of what-ifs and if-then statements, you create separate sections, these extensions, to handle specific failures or alternative paths. Imagine you're writing a use case for an online shopping cart, right? Your main success scenario walks through the happy path. The user adds items to their cart, checks out, enters their payment info, and completes the purchase. But then what happens if their credit card gets declined? Or if something in their cart suddenly goes out of stock? Those are the kinds of things that disrupt the main flow and need a different set of actions.
So instead of cramming all those what-ifs into the main use case, we create these separate branches that deal with specific exceptions.
Precisely. Each extension focuses on a specific failure or alternate path. It outlines what needs to happen to handle that particular situation. So, for example, your credit card declined extension might describe how the system prompts the user to enter a different payment method. Your item out of stock extension could explain how the system removes that item from the cart and notifies the user.
So it's like we're creating a series of mini use cases, each dealing with a particular detour or variation. It sounds much more organized and readable that way, but I imagine it could still feel overwhelming trying to think of every single possible failure point. Where do we draw the line? How do we know when we've done enough?
The book actually acknowledges that trying to be absolutely complete can lead to total paralysis, which is so true. It's more important to have a solid framework for handling those failures than to try and cover every single edge case. Even a rough outline of failure handling is better than nothing. Plus, remember, you can always refine and expand on those extensions as you learn more about the system and where things might go wrong.
That's a relief. It's about finding that balance between thoroughness and, well, not driving yourself crazy. So it's more of an ongoing process. Now, shifting gears a bit, there's this section in the book called The Great Drawing Hoax. It really caught my attention. I've always been a big fan of visual aids, especially when things get complex. But this title makes it sound like we should be careful about relying too much on diagrams, specifically UML diagrams. Why is that?
That's a great question, and the author makes a really interesting point. I tend to agree with him. UML diagrams can be super helpful for visualizing the relationships between different use cases, but they can't replace the need for clear, well-written text. The diagrams are a helpful supplement, but they shouldn't be the main event. The real substance of the use case is in that written description. That's where you explain the interactions, the goals, the steps, the alternative paths, all of that.
So it's about remembering that a diagram is just a tool, not a replacement for good writing. It can illustrate the big picture, but it can't capture all the nuance and detail that makes a use case truly effective.
Exactly. A well-written use case tells a story. It takes you on a journey through the system. You can see who's doing what, why they're doing it, and how the system responds. A diagram can be a great companion to that story, but it can't be the story itself.
Right, because ultimately it's about communicating clearly, and sometimes words are simply the most powerful tool we have. Now, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, that idea of writing the failure conditions first. It still seems a little backwards to me, but I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
I know, it seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But it's funny, once you actually try it, it can really change your whole approach to writing use cases. By forcing yourself to confront those potential failures from the get-go, you end up with a more resilient design. but you also gain a deeper understanding of how the system works and what the users really need.
It's like we're intentionally putting ourselves in the shoes of someone who might run into a problem or get frustrated with the system. And by doing that, we can design solutions that are more empathetic and user-friendly.
That's a great way to put it. We're shifting our perspective from how do we make this system work to how do we make this system work for the people who are going to be using it.
And that shift in thinking can be incredibly powerful. It leads to a more human-centered approach, right? Where the focus is on creating a system that not only functions well, but also meets the needs and expectations of the people using it.
Absolutely. And that, I think, brings us right back to the core purpose of use cases. It's all about capturing how a system delivers value to its users. It's not just about the technical stuff, it's about understanding the human element, the human story that's happening within the system.
Exactly. Behind all those lines of code and technical diagrams, there's a human story waiting to be told. And it's through those stories that we can design systems that are not just functional, but truly meaningful.
I love that. It's those human stories that give our work meaning and purpose.
And those stories often unfold in unexpected ways, revealing all these hidden complexities and surprising insights. Speaking of surprises, I remember another interesting concept from the book, the find a whatever approach. Can you remind us what that's all about?
Oh, yeah. That's a great example of how to write use cases efficiently without sacrificing clarity or detail. It's based on the idea that a lot of use cases actually follow similar patterns.
Hmm.
So instead of writing a completely separate use case for every single search function in a system, for example, you can create a kind of generic find a whatever use case that captures the basic steps involved in any search.
So it's like having a master template that you can then adapt to different situations.
Precisely. You're finding those common elements and using them to create a reusable framework. It saves you time and effort without skimping on the important details.
Brilliant. It's like having a set of building blocks that you can rearrange to create different structures. But how do we know when to use a generic template like that versus writing a more specific, tailored use case? Is there a rule of thumb?
It's a judgment call, to be honest. The key is to strike a balance between efficiency and making sure you're capturing all the specifics. If you're finding yourself writing the same steps over and over again, a generic template might be the way to go. But if the scenario has unique elements or is more complex and requires a detailed explanation, then a tailored use case would be a better choice.
So it's about being aware of the context and using the best tool for the job. Sometimes it's about applying those templates, and sometimes it's about getting more specific and customized. It's about having the flexibility to adapt and come up with solutions that are both efficient and effective. And speaking of challenges, we've really dug deep into this whole world of use case writing today. We've talked about the fundamental stuff like actors and goals, and we've also looked at some really practical techniques like that extension approach and the find a whatever strategy. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a bit of a challenge, something to chew on as they continue on their own use case journeys.
I love that. A little something to spark their curiosity.
Exactly. So here it is. Think about those writing samples we saw in the book, especially the ones demonstrating the find whatever approach. How could you take that same idea, that principle of reusability, and apply it to your own work? Could you create your own library of use case templates or maybe some frameworks for those common scenarios that pop up again and again in your projects?
That's a great challenge. It encourages people to go beyond just listening and actually start applying these ideas to their real-world work.
That's the goal. Take those concepts, those techniques, and make them your own. Build your own personal toolkit for writing use cases that are clear, concise, and compelling. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn, so much to explore, so much to refine.
That's the beauty of it. The world of use case writing is so rich and nuanced. Keep experimenting, keep pushing yourself, and most importantly, keep those human stories at the heart of everything you do.
Beautifully said. So, to all of you listening out there, whether you're a seasoned use case pro or just starting out, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and some practical tools to help you on your way. Keep writing those awesome use cases, keep those stories flowing, and until next time, happy writing, everyone.